The wind that night didn't just blow. It sliced. It was a bitter January razor that cut right through the thin fabric of my coat, finding every gap, every weakness, and settling deep into my bones. I remember standing outside the heavy oak doors of the Obsidian, my fingers numb and red, hesitating for just a split second before pushing my way inside. That hesitation wasn't just about the cold. It was about the dread pooling in my stomach, a heavy, cold stone that I had been carrying around for 6 months now. I was 10 minutes late. In any other job, being 10 minutes late might mean a slap on the wrist or a deducted hour of pay. But here, at the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, it felt like a death sentence. I rushed through the service entrance, my breath hitching in my throat as I stripped off my coat. The warmth of the kitchen hit me like a physical blow, smelling of truffle oil, searing steak, and high-stakes anxiety. Marco, the floor manager, was already there. I could see the tension in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. He didn't yell. That would have been better, honestly. Instead, he just looked at me with that disappointed, tight-lipped expression that made me feel small. I didn't need him to say the words for me to hear them in my head. "Elena, you are hanging by a thread." I apologized, of course. I murmured about the subway delays, about the snow, about anything other than the truth. I couldn't tell him that I had spent the last hour on the phone with a billing department, begging for an extension on a hospice bill that was already 3 months overdue. I couldn't tell him that my hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that I was $5,000 short of keeping my grandmother in her bed for another month. $5,000. It might as well have been 5 million. I tied my apron, the black fabric acting as a shield, a uniform that made me anonymous. That was the goal, after all. To be invisible. For the last 6 months, since I fled Boston in the middle of the night with a split lip and a terrified heart, invisibility had been my only defense. I wasn't Elena the marketing graduate anymore. I wasn't the girl who loved art and poetry. I was just a pair of hands serving wine, a ghost in a black skirt, trying desperately to outrun a man named Brad who treated marriage like a cage match. But tonight, the universe had other plans for my invisibility. Marco grabbed my arm as I tried to slip onto the floor. His grip was tight, urgent. He told me that Jessica had gone home sick, throwing up in the staff bathroom. He told me that I had to take her section. My blood ran cold. Jessica didn't handle the tourists or the casual daters. Jessica handled the VIP rooms, the private tables in the back, where the lighting was dim, the checks were astronomical, and the clientele was complicated. I tried to protest. I tried to tell him that I wasn't ready, that I preferred the main floor where the noise could drown me out. But Marco wasn't asking. He was ordering. He told me to pull myself together, to fix my hair, and to get to table 7 immediately. They were waiting. Table 7. The mention of it sent a hush through the kitchen staff nearby. Everyone knew who sat at table 7. I smoothed my hair, took a deep breath that tasted of fear and sanitizer, and walked toward the back of the restaurant. The noise of the main dining room faded as I entered the private corridor. The carpet was thicker here, swallowing the sound of my footsteps. The air felt heavier, charged with something electric and dangerous. When I pushed open the door to the private room, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a commanding one. 4 men sat around the circular mahogany table. They were wearing suits that cost more than my entire life's earnings, drinking scotch that was older than I was. And then there was him. He sat at the head of the table, facing the door. He didn't look up when I entered, but I felt his attention snap onto me instantly. Dominic Vance. I had never seen him this close, only from across the room or in the terrified whispers of the other staff. He was younger than the rumors suggested, maybe 32 or 33. He had dark hair that was perfectly styled, and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. But it was his stillness that terrified me. The other men were talking, gesturing, moving. Dominic was utterly motionless, a predator waiting in the tall grass. I approached the table, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I went into autopilot. Professional, efficient, invisible. I took their drink orders, my voice steady even though my knees felt like water. I moved around the table, pouring water, placing napkins. I avoided eye contact. That was rule number 1 of survival. Don't look the wolf in the eye. But when I reached his side to refill his glass, I couldn't help it. I glanced up. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they were fixed on my face with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He didn't look at me like a man looking at a pretty waitress. He looked at me like he was reading a book in a language he already knew. He looked at me like he saw the bruises I had covered up months ago, the fear I carried in my purse, the desperation that lived in my bank account. I finished pouring and stepped back into the shadows near the door, trying to disappear into the wallpaper. The men continued their conversation. It was business, but not the kind of business that happened on Wall Street. They spoke in low tones about shipments, about problems at the docks, about people who needed to be reminded of their obligations. I tried not to listen. Hearing things like that was dangerous. Then, my apron pocket vibrated. I froze. I had forgotten to turn my phone off. It buzzed against my hip, an angry, persistent insect. I pressed my hand against it, praying it would stop, but it buzzed again. And again. I checked the caller ID discreetly. It was the hospice facility. My heart stopped. They never called at this hour, unless it was bad, unless it was the end. I looked at the table. The men were deep in an argument. They wouldn't notice. I stepped out into the hallway, leaving the door cracked just a sliver so I could still see them. I answered the phone, my voice barely a whisper. The nurse on the other line sounded apologetic but urgent. She told me my grandmother, my Nona, was having a bad episode. She was confused, in pain, and asking for me. She told me that if I couldn't make a payment by tomorrow morning, they would have to transfer her to a state facility. A state facility. I knew what those places were like. It would kill her. The tears welled up in my eyes before I could stop them. The frustration, the grief, the sheer unfairness of it all crashed over me. I forgot where I was. I forgot the black skirt, the expensive restaurant, the dangerous men inside. I just became a granddaughter, terrified of losing the only person who had ever truly loved her. "No, please," I whispered into the phone, and without thinking, the words slipped out in the language of my childhood, the language Nona and I spoke when the world was too harsh for English. "Ti prego, non fatelo. Troverò I soldi. Te lo giuro su Dio. Domani avrò I soldi. Dile che la amo. Dile di aspettarmi." I spoke the words with the desperate fluency of a native, the Tuscan dialect rolling off my tongue thick with emotion. I wiped a tear from my cheek, taking a shaky breath to compose myself before hanging up. When I turned back to the room, my blood turned to ice. The conversation at the table had stopped. 4 pairs of eyes were staring at me through the crack in the door, but it was Dominic's gaze that paralyzed me. He was leaning forward slightly, his glass of scotch suspended halfway to his mouth. He wasn't looking at me with annoyance for taking a call. He was looking at me with shock. And then, slowly, the shock morphed into something else. Something calculating. I had made a mistake. A massive, stupid mistake. A waitress named Elena from Queens with a generic American accent wasn't supposed to speak flawless native Italian with a Tuscan inflection. I had broken character. I had revealed a layer of myself that I was supposed to keep hidden. I hurried back into the room, my head bowed, mumbling an apology in English. "I'm so sorry, gentlemen. It won't happen again. Let me get your check." My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely hold the leather folder. I felt Dominic's eyes on me every second, tracking my movements, dissecting my panic. One of the other men, a heavy-set guy with a scar on his chin, chuckled darkly. He made a comment to Dominic, asking where he found such talent. But Dominic didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just kept watching me. "You're not from here," Dominic said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, smooth, like velvet wrapped around a dagger. I froze. I live in Queens, sir." "That's not what I meant," he replied. He stood up then, and the room seemed to shrink. He was taller than I expected, towering over the table. He pulled a black credit card from his jacket pocket and placed it on the tray. He didn't hand it to me. He laid it down, his fingers lingering on the plastic for a moment. "Tuscany? Or Florence?" My breath caught. He knew the dialect. "My grandmother," I managed to choke out. "She taught me." He studied me for another long moment, his gaze sweeping from my terrified eyes to my trembling hands, and then down to my name tag that read a lie. "Keep the change," he said. He signaled to his men, and they rose in unison, filing out of the room like a well-trained pack of wolves. Dominic was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at me one last time. There was no warmth in his face, but there was a flicker of something that looked dangerously like possession. When the door clicked shut, I collapsed against the wall, letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for an hour. I was shaking. I just wanted to go home. I wanted to curl up in a ball and forget this night ever happened. I walked over to the table to clear the check. I opened the leather folder to process the payment, and then I stopped breathing. On the receipt, written in a sharp, aggressive hand, was the signature Vance, but it was the line below that made the room spin. In the tip line, he hadn't written 20%. He hadn't written $100. He had written $5,000. $5,000. No commas. Just the numbers, stark and black against the white paper. The exact amount I needed. The exact amount that would save my grandmother. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a gasp. How? How could he possibly know? It was impossible. It had to be a coincidence, a miracle from a cruel God. But then I saw the text written at the bottom of the receipt, just under the total. 3 words that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. 3 words that told me my invisibility was gone forever. Per la nonna. He had heard me. He had understood me. And somehow, in the span of 30 seconds, he had deduced exactly what my desperation was worth. I stared at the money, feeling a wave of nausea and relief crash into each other. I should have been happy. I was saved. But as I clutched that receipt to my chest, looking at the empty chair where the wolf had sat, I knew deep down that this wasn't a gift. Men like Dominic Vance didn't give gifts. They made investments. And I had a terrifying feeling that I had just been purchased. Before I could even process what to do, the door to the private room opened again. It was Marco. He looked pale, even paler than before. "Elena," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Come to the office. Now." "Why?" I asked, clutching the receipt tighter. "Is it about the phone call?" "I can explain." "No," Marco cut me off, looking at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "Mr. Vance is waiting for you in there, and he says he's not leaving until he speaks to you." The hallway leading to the manager's office had never felt so long. It was a narrow corridor lined with lockers and faded health safety posters, usually smelling of stale coffee and bleach. But tonight, walking behind Marco, it felt like I was walking down the gangplank of a pirate ship, the dark water waiting below. Marco stopped at the door, his hand hovering over the knob. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. He was terrified. And if the manager of the restaurant was terrified, what chance did a waitress on the run have? He opened the door and stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. I walked in, and the door clicked shut behind me with a finality that made my heart stutter. The office was a small, cramped room, usually cluttered with invoices and stacks of menus. But tonight, it felt different. The air was sucked out of it. The clutter seemed to fade into the background, because the man sitting behind the cheap metal desk demanded every ounce of attention in the room. Dominic Vance looked out of place in that squeaky office chair. He looked like a panther forced into a dog crate. He had removed his suit jacket, draping it over the back of the chair, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the strong column of his throat. He didn't stand when I entered. He didn't smile. He just watched me with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to strip away every layer of defense I had constructed over the last 6 months. I stood by the door, clutching my apron like a lifeline, waiting for him to speak. I expected him to fire me. I expected him to demand his money back, or to ask why a waitress in Queens spoke Tuscan Italian like a native. But when he finally spoke, his voice was low and terrifyingly calm. He didn't ask a question. He stated a name, Elena Russo. The sound of my real name, spoken in that small room, hit me harder than a physical blow. I hadn't heard it in 6 months. To the world, I was Ellie. To the IRS, I was a ghost. But to Dominic Vance, I was exposed. He picked up a black folder that was sitting on the desk, a sleek, expensive thing that looked alien against the scarred wood, and slid it across to me. I stepped forward on shaky legs, my hand trembling as I reached for it. I didn't want to open it. I knew that whatever was inside was going to hurt. But his gaze was a physical weight, pushing me, commanding me. I flipped it open. The first thing I saw was a photo of me, not a selfie, and not a staff ID photo. It was a picture taken from across the street from my apartment building 3 days ago. I was wearing my gray hoodie, carrying groceries, looking tired and small. I flipped the page. A copy of my college transcript from Boston. A copy of the restraining order I had filed against my ex-husband, Brad. The police report detailing the night he had broken my wrist. My breath hitched in my throat. He knew. He knew everything. He knew I was running. He knew I was hiding. He knew that I checked over my shoulder every time I left my apartment because I was terrified that Brad would find me. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with panic. I asked him, my voice barely a whisper, what he wanted from me, why he had done this. Dominic leaned back in the chair, the squeak of the springs cutting through the tension. He told me that he didn't care about my past. He didn't care about the restraining order or the ex-husband who liked to use his fists. He cared about assets. He cared about utility. He told me he had a business trip to Italy starting tomorrow, 2 weeks. Sicily, then Tuscany. He explained that his usual translator had become unavailable. He needed someone to replace him. But he didn't want a professional agency translator. They asked too many questions. They had families, connections, people who would miss them. He needed someone invisible. Someone with no ties. Someone who spoke the language not just fluently, but natively. Someone who understood the nuance of a threat versus a promise in the Tuscan dialect. He needed me. I stared at him, my mind racing. He wanted me to go to Italy with him? A man I had served wine to once? A man who had stalked me, investigated me, and cornered me in a back office? I closed the folder, my fingers numb. I told him no. I told him I couldn't leave. I had responsibilities here. I had my grandmother. Dominic didn't blink. He just reached into the folder again and pulled out a single sheet of paper that I had missed. It was a medical report from the hospice. He spoke my grandmother's name, Rose, with a softness that was jarring. He told me he knew about her condition. The advanced stage, the pain management, the fact that the facility she was in was understaffed and underfunded. He knew I was 3 months behind on payments. He knew they were threatening to evict her to a state home. Then, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his hands clasped. He made me an offer. He told me that if I agreed to come with him 2 weeks, just a job, nothing more, he would handle Rose. I asked him what he meant by handle. He told me about a clinic in Zurich, Switzerland, the best in Europe. Specialized care for her specific condition, private rooms, round-the-clock specialists. A place where she wouldn't just wait to die, but where she would live her final days in dignity and comfort. He said he could have her transferred there by tomorrow morning. Medical transport, private jet. Everything is taken care of. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a dream. It was everything I had prayed for every night for the last year. But it was impossible. The cost would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. I looked at him, tears stinging my eyes. I asked him how I could ever repay that. 2 weeks of translation work wouldn't cover a fraction of that cost. I asked him if he expected me to sell myself to him. Dominic's expression hardened slightly, the first crack in his impassive mask. He told me he didn't buy women. He bought loyalty. He bought silence. He told me that the cost was irrelevant to him. To him, money was just a tool. To me, it was a miracle. He was trading a miracle for my time. I hesitated. I thought of the danger. My instincts were screaming at me to run. This man was dangerous. He was a predator. Getting on a plane with him was insane. But then I thought of Nona. I thought of the smell of bleach in her cramped room at the hospice. I thought of the bed sores she tried to hide from me. I thought of the fear in her eyes when she forgot where she was. I looked at the tip receipt still clutched in my hand. $5,000. It was a lot of money to me, but to him, it was nothing. To him, sending a dying woman to Switzerland was like buying a cup of coffee. I tried to negotiate. I tried to stall. I told him I needed time to think. I told him I couldn't just leave tonight. Dominic shook his head slowly. He told me there was no time. The plane left at 3 a.m., and then came the twist that stole the air from my lungs. He turned his laptop screen around so I could see it. It was a bank transfer confirmation. He told me to look closely. I squinted at the screen. It was a transfer to the clinic in Zurich. The amount was staggering, but it wasn't a draft. It wasn't pending. It was completed, time-stamped 20 minutes ago. He told me the medical transport team was already en route to the hospice in Queens. They would be there in less than an hour to pick up Rose. I stared at him, my mouth falling open. He hadn't waited for my answer. He hadn't waited for me to agree. He had paid for it already. I asked him, my voice trembling with a mix of fury and gratitude, why he would do that. What if I said no? What if I walked out that door right now? Dominic stood up then, buttoning his jacket. He walked around the desk until he was standing right in front of me, so close I could smell the scent of expensive scotch and sandalwood. He looked down at me and told me that I wouldn't say no. He said he saw the way I looked at the receipt. He saw the desperation in my eyes. He knew I loved my grandmother more than I loved my own safety. He said he had already bought the miracle. Now, I just had to decide if I was honorable enough to pay for it. It was a trap. A beautiful, golden, life-saving trap. He had saved the person I loved most in the world, and in doing so, he had chained me to him completely. I couldn't say no. How could I? If I walked away, I would be turning my back on the only chance Rose had. I would be ungrateful, selfish. He had stripped me of my choice by giving me exactly what I wanted. I looked up into his dark eyes, searching for any sign of humanity, any sign of regret. I found none, just a calm, terrifying certainty. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air of the room fill my lungs. I felt the invisible handcuffs click around my wrists. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll go." Dominic didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded, as if the sun rising in the east was a surprise to no one. He reached past me and opened the door. He told me the car was waiting out back. He told me not to worry about packing. He said I wouldn't need the clothes I had in Queens, where we were going. As I walked out of the office, leaving Marco and the restaurant and my invisible life behind, I realized I wasn't just accepting a job. I was stepping off the edge of the map. I was entering the territory of monsters. But as I touched the pocket where the receipt lay, knowing my grandmother was going to be safe, I realized something else. For her, I would walk through hell. And looking at Dominic Vance's broad back as he led me to the exit, I had a feeling that hell was exactly where we were going. The car ride to the private airfield was a blur of passing streetlights and silence. I sat in the back of the sleek black SUV, the leather cool against my legs, watching the city I had called home for 6 months fade into the rearview mirror. New York was a city of millions, a place where you could disappear, where you could be anyone or no one. But as we merged onto the highway, leaving the skyline behind, I felt like I was being untethered from the earth itself. I was no longer Elena the waitress. I was no longer Ellie the fugitive. I was simply his. Dominic sat beside me, typing on his phone, the blue light illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He didn't speak to me. He didn't offer reassurances or small talk. He acted as if acquiring a human being for a 2-week trip was just another item on his checklist, right between review quarterly earnings and approved shipping manifest. When we arrived at the tarmac, the wind was whipping around us, carrying the scent of jet fuel and snow. The plane waiting for us wasn't just a jet. It was a silver predator crouching on the asphalt. I had seen planes like this in movies, in magazines, but standing at the foot of the stairs, looking up at the illuminated cabin, I felt a wave of nausea. This was the point of no return. Once those doors closed, the laws of the ground no longer applied. Up there, in the sky, his word would be the only law that mattered. I climbed the stairs, my legs heavy, clutching my purse like a shield. The flight attendant's greeting was beautiful, polished, and terrifyingly professional. She didn't look at my scuffed boots or my fraying coat. She looked through me, as if I were just luggage that happened to breathe. The interior of the jet was a world away from the cold tarmac. It smelled of expensive leather, fresh orchids, and power. There were no rows of cramped seats. Instead, there were cream-colored armchairs that looked more comfortable than my bed in Queens, a mahogany conference table, and a sofa that spanned the width of the cabin. It was quiet, insulated from the roar of the engines outside. It was a golden cage, floating in the sky. Dominic gestured for me to sit. He didn't ask if I was comfortable. He didn't ask if I was afraid of flying. He simply pointed to a seat across from him, and I obeyed. That was the dynamic now. He commanded, and I obeyed. I sank into the buttery leather, feeling small and out of place. I tucked my hands under my legs to stop them from shaking. As the plane taxied and roared into the night sky, leaving the lights of New York behind, I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest. I thought of Rose. At this very moment, she was being prepped for transport. Strangers were lifting her frail body onto a stretcher. Was she scared? Did she know I had done this for her? Or did she think I had abandoned her? The guilt was a heavy stone in my stomach, warring with the relief that she was going to survive. Once we reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant appeared with a garment bag. She hung it on a hook near the small bathroom at the back of the cabin and then retreated. Dominic finally looked up from his tablet. He studied me for a moment, his gaze critical, dissecting me from my messy bun to my worn-out boots. He told me to go change. He said that the clothes I was wearing were fine for a dinner in Queens, but they wouldn't work where we were going. He said I needed to look the part. I asked him what part that was. The translator? The employee? He didn't blink. He told me I was playing the part of someone who belonged in his world. And in his world, weakness was not tolerated. Poverty, he said, was a form of weakness. He wanted me armored. I stood up, my cheeks burning with humiliation. It wasn't just a gift. It was an erasure. He was erasing the evidence of my struggle, painting over my reality with his wealth. I took the garment bag into the small, luxurious bathroom and unzipped it. Inside, I found a wardrobe that cost more than I had made in 5 years. There were silk blouses, tailored trousers that felt like water against my skin, and a cashmere coat in a soft camel color. There were even boots made of Italian leather that smelled rich and earthy. I stared at myself in the mirror as I changed. The woman staring back didn't look like Ellen, the victim. She looked sharper, harder. She looked like someone who could survive a wolf. When I emerged, Dominic was pouring a drink. He paused, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal glass. His eyes swept over me, taking in the way the silk blouse draped over my frame, the way the trousers lengthened my legs. For a second, the air in the cabin shifted. It became thick and harder to breathe. He didn't smile. He didn't compliment me. He just nodded, a curt, satisfied gesture that said acceptable. He handed me a glass of water, his fingers brushing mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a shock of heat straight up my arm. I pulled back as if burned. I hated that reaction. I hated that despite my fear, despite the coercion, my body recognized his power and responded to it. It was a biological betrayal. I sat back down, sipping the water, trying to steady my nerves. Dominic returned to his work, reviewing documents that were spread out on the table between us. I watched him covertly. In the harsh light of the reading lamp, I could see things I hadn't noticed in the restaurant. I saw the faint white scar running through his left eyebrow. I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he rubbed his temple as if warding off a headache. He wasn't just a monster. He was a machine that ran on control and calculation. I wondered what it must be like to be him, to carry the weight of an empire, to have people fear you before they even met you. Was he ever lonely? Or was loneliness a luxury he couldn't afford? The plane suddenly lurched. A pocket of turbulence hit us, dropping the cabin a few feet before stabilizing. My glass rattled on the table, water splashing onto the polished wood. I gasped, my hands gripping the armrests, my knuckles turning white. I had always hated flying, and the sudden drop made my stomach flip. Before I could even process the fear, Dominic was there. He hadn't moved to save the documents or his expensive scotch. His hand had shot out across the table and gripped my wrist. His hold was firm, grounding. His skin was warm, his thumb pressing against the frantic pulse in my wrist. He told me to breathe. He said it was just air. He said the plane wasn't going to fall. His voice was calm, steady, an anchor in the storm. I looked at him, my eyes wide. For a moment, we were just two people suspended in the dark, the predator and the prey, holding hands over an abyss. I felt safe. God help me. In that moment, with his hand on mine, I felt safer than I had in 6 months of hiding in my locked apartment. The turbulence passed as quickly as it had come. Dominic withdrew his hand slowly, the loss of his touch leaving a cold spot on my skin. He didn't acknowledge the moment. He grabbed a napkin and wiped up the spilled water, his face returning to that impassive mask. But the energy between us had changed. The line had been blurred. Hours later, the cabin lights were dimmed. Dominic had finally stopped working. He was asleep in the chair across from me, his head resting against the wingback. Asleep, he looked younger. The deep lines of stress around his mouth had smoothed out. His eyelashes cast long shadows on his cheekbones. He looked human. I sat there in the semi-darkness, watching the rise and fall of his chest. It would have been easy to hate him if he were a caricature of a villain. Suppose he were cruel for the sake of cruelty. But he wasn't. He was cruel for a purpose. He had saved my grandmother. He had given me a lifeline, even if he had tied it into a noose. I realized then that I wasn't just afraid of him. I was afraid of myself. I was afraid of the part of me that was drawn to the darkness he radiated. I was afraid that if I stayed in this golden cage too long, I might forget how to fly on my own. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing our descent. I looked out the window. Below us, the world was waking up. The Mediterranean Sea was a sheet of hammered steel under the gray dawn light. And there, rising from the water like a rugged jewel, was Sicily. The landscape was jagged, ancient, and breathtaking. Rolling hills, cliffs that dropped into the sea, and old stone buildings that looked like they had stood for 1,000 years. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. As the landing gear deployed with a mechanical groan, I pressed my hand against the cold glass. I was thousands of miles from Queens, thousands of miles from who I used to be. I was landing in his territory now. His rules, his language, his land. Dominic stirred, waking instantly. He didn't grope for consciousness like normal people. He just opened his eyes and was fully awake and alert. He looked at me staring out the window. He told me to prepare myself. He said that where we were going, things were different. He said I needed to remember who I was and who I belonged to for the next 2 weeks. I turned to face him, the coastline of Sicily reflecting in my eyes. I told him I wouldn't forget, but as the wheels touched the tarmac with a screech of rubber, I knew he was wrong. The problem wasn't forgetting who I was. The problem was that I was about to find out exactly who I was capable of becoming. And looking at Dominic Vance, the devil who had bought my soul for the price of a hospital bill, I had a feeling that the woman who stepped off this plane wouldn't be the same one who got on. The door opened, and the scent of lemons and sea salt flooded the cabin. "Welcome to hell, Elena," I whispered to myself. "Welcome home," Dominic said, standing up and buttoning his jacket, ready to lead me into the lion's den. The drive from the airstrip to the villa was a journey through time. We left the modern asphalt behind and began winding our way up narrow, ancient roads lined with cypress trees that stood like silent sentinels against the gray morning sky. I watched the landscape roll by through the tinted window olive groves that stretched endlessly, vineyards sleeping under the winter chill, and crumbling stone walls that had probably stood since the Roman Empire. Dominic remained silent beside me. He didn't look at the scenery. He owned it, or at least, he looked like he did. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set. His mind likely already 3 moves ahead in whatever dangerous game he was playing. I wanted to ask him where exactly we were, but the air in the car was too heavy for questions. When the villa finally came into view, my breath hitched. I had expected a house, maybe a mansion, but this was a fortress. It was a sprawling structure of honey-colored stone, perched on the edge of a cliff, dominating the valley below. It had high walls, iron gates that looked impenetrable, and a sense of history that felt almost crushing. It was beautiful, yes, but it was the kind of beauty that warned you to keep your distance. It was a place built by men who had enemies. The gates groaned open as we approached, and the car crunched over the gravel driveway. A team of staff was already waiting on the steps. They didn't look like the friendly hotel staff I was used to seeing in movies. They stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, their expressions unreadable, their eyes fixed respectfully on the ground. Dominic exited the car first. The moment his feet touched the gravel, his posture changed. He stood taller, his shoulders squared. He wasn't just a businessman here. He was the lord of the manor. He was the wolf returning to his den. I scrambled out after him, clutching my coat tight against the wind. A woman stepped forward, older, with a kind face that seemed out of place among the stone-faced guards. She introduced herself as Maria. She didn't speak to Dominic. She spoke to me, her voice warm and welcoming in Italian. She told me that I must be exhausted, that my room was ready, but she imagined I wanted to see my grandmother first. My heart leaped into my throat. Nona. I turned to Dominic, seeking permission. It was a reflex now, looking to him for cues. He nodded once, a sharp, dismissive gesture. He told Maria to take me to the medical wing. He said he would join us shortly after he checked in with security. I followed Maria through the massive wooden doors. The interior of the villa was a maze of vaulted ceilings, tapestries, and marble floors that echoed with our footsteps. But I didn't care about the art or the architecture. I just wanted to see her. We reached a set of double doors on the ground floor. Maria opened them gently, and the scent hit me first. It didn't smell like the hospice in Queens. It didn't smell like bleach and decay. It smelled of lavender and fresh linen. The room was spacious, filled with natural light from large windows that overlooked a private garden. And there, in the center of the room, in a specialized medical bed that looked more like a cloud than a hospital cot, was Rose. She was asleep. A monitor beeped softly, rhythmically, beside her. A nurse, a young man in crisp scrubs, looked up and smiled, stepping back to give me space. I approached the bed slowly, my vision blurring with tears. She looked peaceful. The lines of pain that had etched themselves into her forehead over the last few months were gone. Her skin had a better color, no longer that terrifying gray. Her hair had been brushed. She looked like the Nona I remembered from my childhood, before the sickness took hold. I collapsed into the chair beside her and took her hand. It was warm. For the first time in months, her hand was warm. I pressed my cheek against her palm and wept. I cried for the fear of the last 6 months, for the indignity of the hospice, for the relief that washed over me like a tidal wave. I didn't care about the cost anymore. I didn't care that I had sold 2 weeks of my life to a dangerous man. Looking at her face, so calm and rested, I knew I would have sold a decade. I sat there for what felt like hours, just listening to her breathe. Eventually, her eyelids fluttered. She opened her eyes, and unlike the confusion I had grown used to, there was a spark of clarity. She looked at me, her lips curling into a weak smile. She whispered my name, Elena, and reached up to touch my face. She told me I looked tired. She asked if I was eating enough. Even on her deathbed, she was still worrying about me. I laughed through my tears, telling her I was fine, that we were safe. I told her we were in Italy, that a friend had helped us. Her brow furrowed slightly. She asked about the friend. She asked who had brought us back to the old country. Before I could answer, the door opened. Dominic walked in. He had changed out of his travel clothes into a fresh suit, charcoal gray and perfectly tailored. He filled the room with his presence, the air seeming to vibrate around him. The nurse nodded respectfully and slipped out of the room, leaving the 3 of us alone. I stood up, wiping my face, suddenly self-conscious. But Dominic wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Rose, and in his eyes, usually so cold and guarded, I saw something I didn't recognize. Respect, maybe even reverence. He approached the bed slowly, his hands clasped in front of him. He spoke to her in Italian, his voice soft and low. He asked her if she was comfortable. He asked if the doctors were treating her well. Rose stared at him. Her hazel eyes, faded by age but still sharp, locked onto his face. She studied him with an intensity that made me nervous. She looked at his jawline, his dark hair, the way he held himself. Then, she asked a question that stopped my heart. She asked him if he was Antonio's boy. Not my Antonio. She asked if he was the son of Lorenzo Vance. Dominic stiffened. A shadow passed over his face, but he didn't look away. He nodded. He told her yes, he was Lorenzo's son. Rose let out a long, shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. She whispered that she thought she saw the ghost of his father in him. She said he had the same eyes that had seen too much darkness. I looked between them, confused. I asked Nona what she was talking about. How could she possibly know Dominic's father? We were from different worlds. We were nobodies from Queens. The Vances were, whatever they were, kings. Rose looked at me, her hand tightening on mine with surprising strength. She told me to listen. She said that before I was born, before my parents died, before we moved to America, my grandfather, her husband, Antonio, had worked for the Vance family in Tuscany. She said he wasn't just a gardener or a driver, he was a protector. He was a man of honor. She told me the story of a night 40 years ago, an ambush. A rival family is trying to wipe out the Vances. She told me that my grandfather, Antonio, had thrown himself in front of a bullet meant for Lorenzo Vance, Dominic's father. My grandfather died on that pavement so that Dominic's father could live. The room spun. I stared at Dominic. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the floor, his jaw clenched tight. He knew. He had known the whole time. I asked him, my voice trembling, if it was true. Dominic looked up. His eyes were dark pools of ancient guilt. He told me it was true. He said that his father never forgot the debt. He said that the name Russo was written in the family ledgers in ink that never faded. He explained that when he saw my name on the employee file at the restaurant, he was curious. When he ran the background check and saw Rose's name, he realized who we were. We were the descendants of the man who saved his bloodline. I felt a strange, dizzying shift in my reality. I wasn't just a random waitress he had plucked from obscurity because I spoke Italian. I wasn't just a pretty face he wanted to use. I was connected to him by blood and gunpowder. My grandfather's death had brought his father's life, which in turn had given life to him. I asked him why he hadn't told me. Why the games? Why the coercion? Why make me feel like I was selling myself when there was this history between us? Dominic walked over to the window, looking out at the gray hills. He kept his back to me. He said that debts were complicated things. He said he didn't want my gratitude. He didn't want me to feel like I was a charity case receiving a payout for a ghost sacrifice. He turned back to face me, his expression hardening again, the mask slipping back into place. He told me that he needed a translator. and I needed money. That was the transaction. The past was just context. But I knew he was lying. I could see it in the way he stood, the way he had looked at Rose. This wasn't just business. He had saved Rose not because he was kind, but because he was bound by a code of honor I didn't understand. He was paying a debt 40 years in the making. I looked down at Rose, who was drifting back to sleep, a faint smile on her lips. She felt safe because she knew who he was. She knew that in his world, a blood debt was more binding than any contract. For the first time since I stepped into that restaurant, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like something else. I wasn't an outsider in this fortress. In a strange, twisted way, my family's blood was mixed into the mortar of these walls. Dominic checked his watch. The moment of vulnerability was over. The wolf was back. He told me to let her rest. He said I needed to get ready. The dinner tonight was important. He reminded me of the rules. Observe, listen, translate. He said the men coming tonight were sharks, and if they sensed blood in the water, they would attack. He walked to the door, then paused, his hand on the frame. He didn't look back, but his voice was softer when he spoke. He told me that my grandfather was a brave man. He said he hoped I had inherited more than just his name. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the steady beep of the monitor and the ghosts of the past swirling around me. I squeezed Rose's hand one last time and stood up. I wiped my tears. I went to the window and looked out at the jagged landscape of his world. I wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. I was fighting for a legacy. If my grandfather could stand in front of a bullet for this family, then I could certainly stand in front of a few businessmen and lie for them. I walked out of the room, my head held high. Dominic Vance wanted a partner for the night? Fine, he was going to get one. I was a Russo, and tonight, I was going to prove that his investment and my grandfather's sacrifice had not been in vain. The hours leading up to the dinner felt less like preparing for a meal and more like armoring up for battle. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my room, staring at a stranger. The woman reflected back at me wasn't the girl who counted pennies at the grocery store. She was a vision in midnight blue silk. The dress Dominic had selected, or rather, commanded me to wear, was deceptive. From the front, it was modest, with a high neck and long sleeves, but the back was open all the way to the base of my spine, leaving my skin exposed to the cool air of the villa. It was a statement piece. It said, "Look, but don't touch." It was elegant, expensive, and entirely calculated. There was a knock at the door, sharp and precise. I didn't need to ask who it was. Dominic entered without waiting for an invitation. He was dressed in a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, the stark black and white emphasizing the dangerous darkness of his eyes. He stopped in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over me with a critical, assessing intensity. He didn't tell me I looked beautiful. He told me I looked ready. He was holding a long, slender velvet box. He walked toward me, the sound of his shoes on the marble floor echoing in the silence. He opened the box, and inside lay a string of pearls. They weren't the small, delicate pearls you see in department stores. These were large, lustrous, and perfectly matched. They glowed with an iridescent sheen that looked almost moonlight-captured. He told me to turn around. I obeyed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt the cool weight of the pearls settle against my collarbone, followed by the warmth of his fingers as he fastened the clasp at the nape of my neck. His touch lingered for a moment, his fingertips grazing the sensitive skin where my pulse jumped. It was intimate, possessive, and terrifying. He leaned close to my ear, his breath warm against my skin. He whispered the rules of engagement. He said that tonight, the pearls were not just a decoration. They were a tool, a signal. He explained that the men we were meeting, Marcus Ferrero and his associates, were liars. They would smile, they would drink his wine, and they would try to cheat him. He needed me to be his lie detector. He told me that if Ferrero or his men said anything untrue, anything that contradicted the deal, or anything suspicious in Italian, I was to reach up and touch the pearls. Touch the pearl, signal the lie. It sounded simple. But as I turned to face him, seeing the steely resolve in his eyes, I knew it was anything but. I wasn't just a translator anymore. I was an active participant in a high-stakes game of deception. I asked him what would happen if I missed something. What if I failed? Dominic looked at me, his expression unreadable. He told me that failure wasn't an option. He reminded me whose blood ran in my veins. He said that a Russo didn't miss. We descended the grand staircase together, his hand resting on the small of my back, a gesture that looked protective to an outsider but felt like a brand of ownership to me. The dining room had been transformed. The long mahogany table was set with crystal and silver, lit by the soft glow of candlelight. But the atmosphere was anything but romantic. It was charged with tension, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and suppressed aggression. Marcus Ferrero was waiting. He was an older man, perhaps in his 50s, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his shark-like eyes. He was flanked by two younger associates who looked more like bodyguards in suits than businessmen. When Dominic introduced me, Ferrero's eyes raked over me with a lecherous familiarity that made my skin crawl. He took my hand, kissing it a fraction too long, his lips wet against my knuckles. He complimented Dominic on his exquisite taste, speaking about me as if I were a piece of furniture or a rare bottle of wine. I smiled, the perfect, polite smile I had practiced in the mirror. I played the part, the beautiful, silent companion, the distraction. Dinner was a blur of courses I couldn't taste. I ate mechanically, my senses tuned to the frequency of the conversation around me. They spoke in a mix of English and Italian. The surface conversation was cordial business trends, shipping routes, and the challenges of the European market. Dominic was calm, his voice steady and authoritative. Ferrero was charming, laughing loudly, pouring more wine, acting the part of the friendly collaborator. But I was listening to the undercurrents. I was listening to the rapid-fire Italian asides Ferrero muttered to his associates when Dominic was ostensibly distracted by his food. They thought I was just a pretty face. They assumed that because I was with an American boss, my Italian would be limited to hello and thank you. They didn't know I had grown up in a house where the Tuscan dialect was the language of secrets. Midway through the main course, the conversation turned to the acquisition of a shipping port in Livorno. Dominic was pushing for a specific price based on the inventory held in the warehouses there. Ferrero nodded, agreeing that the inventory was substantial, worth millions. He assured Dominic, in English, that the warehouses were fully stocked with high-value electronics and luxury goods. Then, he turned to his associate on his left and muttered something in a rapid, slurred dialect, a mix of Sicilian and street slang. I capanoni sono vuoti. La roba è già partita per Napoli. Gli vendiamo aria fritta. My heart stopped. They were scamming him. They were selling him empty shells for millions of dollars. I looked at Dominic. He was cutting his steak, his expression serene. He hadn't reacted. He hadn't understood the slang, or perhaps he hadn't heard it over the clinking of silverware. The room seemed to tilt. This was it. The moment. If I stayed silent, the deal would go through. Dominic would lose millions. He would look weak, and when he found out, because men like him always found out, he would know I had failed him. But if I signaled, I was declaring war. I was stepping out of the shadows and into the line of fire. Ferrero was smiling at Dominic, raising his glass for a toast to their future partnership. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my left hand. I felt the eyes of everyone at the table on me. I reached up and curled my fingers around the large central pearl of the necklace. The cool gem bit into my palm. Dominic's eyes flicked to my hand instantly. A microscopic tightening of his jaw was the only sign that he had seen it. He didn't look at me. He looked back at Ferrero, his smile not faltering for a second, but he needed to know what the lie was. A signal wasn't enough. He needed ammunition. I took a breath, calculating the risk. I picked up the wine decanter and moved to refill Dominic's glass, leaning in close to him. I broke the cardinal rule of invisibility. As I poured the wine, I spoke in English, but I kept my voice low, intimate, as if I were a lover whispering a sweet nothing. I told him that the wine was excellent, but he should be careful. It tasted light, almost empty, like the warehouses in Livorno. I added that perhaps the vintage had been moved to Naples without a label. It was a code woven into a compliment. Dominic didn't react visibly. He just took a sip of his wine, savoring it, but I saw the shift in his eyes. The predator had just woken up. He set his glass down with a soft click. He looked at Ferrero, his expression changing from polite businessman to something much darker, much more dangerous. He told Ferrero that he had a sudden concern about the logistics. He said that before they signed the contract, he wanted an independent audit of the Livorno inventory, tonight. He said he had a team nearby ready to verify the stock. Ferrero's smile froze. The color drained from his face. He stammered, saying that wasn't necessary, that it was late, that the keys were with the manager. Dominic leaned forward, his voice dropping to that terrifyingly calm register I remembered from the office in New York. He asked Ferrero why he was nervous. He asked if there was any reason the warehouses might be lighter than advertised. The silence in the room was deafening. Ferrero looked at Dominic, then his eyes darted to me. He realized then. He realized the dumb American mistress had understood every word. The hate in his eyes was visceral, a physical weight that made me want to shrink back. But I didn't. I held his gaze, my hand still resting lightly on the pearls. I was a Russo. I wouldn't flinch. Dominic didn't give him time to recover. He began to dismantle Ferrero's position with surgical precision. He cited the exact value of the missing goods. He adjusted the offer price down, drastically down. He turned the scam back on Ferrero, using the attempted theft as leverage to buy the port for pennies on the dollar. Ferrero had no choice. He was caught. If he walked away, he admitted the fraud and started a war he couldn't win. If he signed, he lost millions but kept his life. He signed. He signed the papers with a shaking hand, his face a mask of fury. When he stood up to leave, he didn't kiss my hand. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and muttered something in Italian about beautiful things being easily broken. Dominic stood up and moved between us, blocking Ferrero's view of me. He told Ferrero to leave. He said that if he ever looked at me again, he would remove his eyes. When the heavy doors finally closed behind Ferrero and his men, the adrenaline that had been holding me up suddenly crashed. My knees felt weak. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. The room was silent again, but the energy had changed. It wasn't tense anymore. It was electric. Dominic turned to me. He didn't say a word. He walked around the table, closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. He stopped inches from me, his presence overwhelming. He reached out and touched the pearl necklace, tracing the line of gems that I had used as a weapon. His eyes were blazing with something intense triumph. Yes, but also something hotter, something that looked dangerously like pride. He told me that I was magnificent. He said he had expected me to be useful. He hadn't expected me to be lethal. He took my hand, the one that had signaled the lie, and brought it to his lips. He kissed the palm of my hand, right where the pearl had pressed against my skin. It wasn't a gentleman's kiss. It was a searing, intimate contact that sent a shockwave through my entire body. I stared up at him, breathless. I realized then that we had just crossed another line. We weren't just employer and employee anymore. We weren't just debtor and creditor. We were accomplices. We had stood in the fire together and come out unscathed. I told him, my voice trembling, that I didn't like being underestimated. Dominic smiled, a genuine wolfish grin that transformed his face. He told me that he would never make the mistake of underestimating me again. He said that tonight, I hadn't just paid off a debt. I had earned my place at the table. But as I looked at the signed contract on the table, the proof of our victory, I felt a chill of foreboding. Ferrero's parting look haunted me. We had won the battle, but looking at the intensity in Dominic's eyes, I feared I was losing the war for my own heart. I was falling for the thrill. I was falling for the power. And God help me, I was falling for the monster who gave it to me. The silence that followed our victory in the dining room wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, laden with the kind of tension that makes the air feel thick enough to choke on. Dominic led me out of the room, his hand still warm against my back. But he didn't take me to the staircase. He led me through a heavy oak door into his study. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and the lingering scent of cigar smoke. It was a masculine space, a sanctuary where he likely plotted the rise and fall of his enemies. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, his movements fluid and precise. He handed one to me, his fingers brushing mine, the contact sending that familiar jolt of electricity through my veins. I took the glass, my hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. I watched him as he loosened his tie, unbuttoning the top button of his shirt. It was such a human gesture, so domestic, that it felt jarring coming from the man who had just dismantled a rival without raising his voice. He turned to me, leaning against the edge of his massive desk, crossing his ankles. He looked at me for a long time, his dark eyes searching my face. Then, he spoke. He didn't talk about the money he had saved, or the contract he had secured. He talked about me. He confessed that he had never worked with a partner before. He said he was used to obedience, to fear, to pay loyalty. But tonight, he had seen something different. He had seen fire. He told me that when I touched the pearl, when I looked Ferrero in the eye and lied for him, I hadn't just been translating. I had been ruling beside him, my breath caught in my throat. I tried to tell him that I was just doing my job, just paying my debt. But the words died on my tongue. We both knew that was a lie. What had happened in that dining room wasn't business. It was intimacy. It was a shared secret that bound us tighter than any contract. He pushed off the desk and walked toward me. He stopped inches away, invading my personal space until all I could see was him. All I could smell was sandalwood and scotch. He reached out and cupped my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. His hand was rough, calloused a fighter's hand, but his touch was agonizingly gentle. He admitted, his voice barely a whisper, that I was becoming a problem. He said that a man in his position couldn't afford weaknesses, he couldn't afford distractions. And yet, looking at me, standing in the wreckage of his well-ordered life, he found that he didn't want to look away. I should have stepped back. I should have remembered the danger, the manipulation, the fact that he had essentially bought me. But I didn't. I leaned into his touch. I was starving for it. After years of running, of hiding, of being made to feel small and worthless by a man who claimed to love me, Dominic's obsession felt like a drug. He didn't make me feel small. He made me feel dangerous. He lowered his head, his eyes locking onto my lips. The kiss, when it finally came, wasn't tentative. It wasn't sweet. It was a collision. It was a claim. His lips were hot and demanding, tasting of whiskey and desperation. He kissed me like he was trying to devour me, like he was trying to breathe me in. I responded with equal force, my hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. For a moment, there was no mafia, no debts, no grandmother dying in a clinic. There was just the fire consuming us both. He pulled back breathlessly, resting his forehead against mine. He whispered my name like a prayer or a curse. He told me that I was his, not because of a contract, not because of money, but because we were cut from the same cloth. I went to bed that night with my lips swollen and my heart racing. I stared at the ceiling, terrifyingly happy. I thought I understood the game. I thought I knew the rules. But I was wrong. The game had barely begun. The next morning, the sun over Tuscany was bright and unforgiving. The intimacy of the night before seemed to evaporate in the harsh light of day. Dominic was back to being the boss, cool, collected, distant. We were scheduled to attend a private viewing at an art gallery in Florence. He said it was necessary for appearances. He needed to be seen, to show that his business was thriving, that he was untouchable. I dressed in a cream-colored suit he had provided, pulling my hair back into a severe bun. I felt exposed. The armor of the night before was gone. Now, walking through the crowded gallery filled with Florence's elite, I felt like an imposter again. The gallery was beautiful, filled with modern sculptures and avant-garde paintings that I pretended to understand. Dominic was charming, navigating the room with the ease of a politician. He introduced me as his associate, his hand resting possessively on my lower back. But he was distracted. His eyes were constantly scanning the room, checking the exits, watching the faces in the crowd. Midway through the event, a man in a gray suit approached us. He whispered something in Dominic's ear. Dominic stiffened. He turned to me, his expression apologetic but firm. He told me he had to take a call, highly sensitive. He couldn't do it here. He asked me to wait for him, to enjoy the art, and promised he wouldn't be long. He left me standing in front of a jagged metal sculpture that looked like a car crash frozen in time. I watched him disappear into a private office at the back of the gallery. I felt a sudden chill, a sense of vulnerability that I couldn't shake. Without him, the room felt hostile. I decided to find the restroom, needing a moment to breathe, to splash cold water on my face, and remind myself that I was safe. The restroom was down a quiet corridor lined with black and white photographs. It was empty when I entered. I leaned against the marble sink, staring at my reflection. "Who are you?" I asked the woman in the mirror. "Are you Elena, the waitress? Or are you the woman who kisses Mafia dons in the dark?" When I exited the restroom, I wasn't alone. Marcus Ferrero was leaning against the wall in the corridor, blocking my path. My heart slammed against my ribs. I hadn't seen him in the gallery. I hadn't known he would be here. He looked different from the way he had at dinner. The charm was gone. The fake smile was gone. He looked cold, hateful, and smug. I tried to step around him, murmuring an excuse, but he moved to block me. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. His presence was a physical barrier. He spoke to me in Italian, his voice dripping with mock pity. He asked if I was enjoying the exhibition. He asked if I was enjoying my time with the Prince of Tuscany. I told him I had nothing to say to him. I told him to let me pass. Ferrero laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. He shook his head, looking at me with something that looked disturbingly like sympathy. He told me that I was a tragedy waiting to happen. He said I actually believed it. Didn't I? I believed the fairy tale. I believed that the big bad wolf had fallen in love with the little lamb. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked him what he meant. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He told me to open my eyes. He asked why I thought Dominic had brought me here. Did I really think it was for my translation skills? Did I really think there weren't 1,000 people in Italy who could speak English and Italian? He told me the truth, or his version of it. He said that Dominic was under investigation. The FBI, the Guardia di Finanza, they were all circling him. They were watching his movements, tapping his phones. Dominic needed a shield. He needed a distraction. He needed a civilian. Ferrero explained, with cruel precision, that bringing a known criminal associate to Italy would have raised red flags. But bringing a pretty, innocent American girl, a girl with a sad backstory and a dying grandmother, that painted a different picture. It made him look like a philanthropist. It made him look like a lover on a romantic getaway, not a crime lord finalizing a merger. He called me a decoy, a clean skin, a lightning rod. He said that while the police were busy running background checks on me, while they were busy wondering who the mystery girl was, Dominic was moving his assets. Dominic was signing deals, and when the heat got too high, Ferrero shrugged. He said that decoys were disposable. That was their purpose, to be burned so the real asset could escape. I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him he was a liar, that he was just bitter because we had beaten him. But the insidious thing about his words was that they made sense. They fit the pieces of the puzzle that I had been too blinded by romance to see. Why me? Why not a professional? Why the elaborate dossier? Why the sudden, overwhelming generosity? Was the kiss just part of the performance? Was the tenderness just to keep the decoy compliant? Ferrero saw the doubt in my eyes. He smiled, satisfied. He stepped back, clearing the path. He told me to enjoy the rest of my trip. However long it lasted, he walked away, leaving me standing alone in the corridor, shivering in my expensive suit. I walked back into the main gallery, my legs feeling like lead. I saw Dominic emerging from the office. He spotted me immediately. His face lit up when he saw me. He started walking toward me, a smile playing on his lips, that same smile that had melted me the night before. But now, looking at him, I didn't see the savior. I didn't see the partner. I saw a man who played chess with human lives. He reached me, reaching out to take my hand. He asked if I was okay. He said I looked pale. I pulled my hand away, instinctively, flinching from his touch. Dominic froze. His smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, scanning my face, then scanning the room behind me. He saw the shadow of Ferrero slipping out of the exit door. He knew. He looked back at me, and I saw the realization hit him. He knew that poison had been poured into my ear. He tried to speak. He said my name, his voice urgent. Elena. But I couldn't hear him. All I could hear was the echo of the word decoy. All I could feel was the fool's gold of the pearl necklace burning against my skin. I looked at him, and for the first time since I got on that plane, I didn't feel safe. I felt used. And the heartbreak of that realization was sharper than any knife he could have carried. I want to go back, I whispered, my voice breaking. I want to go back to the villa. Dominic studied me, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain. He just nodded, his face turning into that familiar stone mask. Okay, he said quietly. But as we walked to the car, the distance between us was vast. It was a chasm filled with secrets, and I wasn't sure if we could ever build a bridge across it again. The kiss was a lie. The partnership was a sham. I was just a pawn in a game I didn't understand. And the worst part was, even knowing all that, I still wanted him to hold my hand. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the massive bed in the guest suite, staring at the closed door, still wearing the cream suit from the gallery. The silence of the villa, which had once felt majestic, now felt oppressive, like the held breath before a scream. Every shadow looked like a lie. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a betrayal. Marcus Ferrero's words echoed in my mind on an endless loop. Decoy, distraction, disposable. I wanted to hate Dominic. I wanted to pack my bags, demand a car, and leave him to his fate. But beneath the anger, there was a terrified part of me that was praying Ferrero was the liar. I was waiting for Dominic to burst through that door and tell me it was all a game, a misunderstanding, that I was the only thing that mattered, but he didn't come. Hours ticked by. 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. Then, at 3:15, the world exploded. It didn't start with a knock. It started with a sound that tore through the night air, the rhythmic, chopping beat of helicopter blades directly overhead. Then came the sirens. A wailing chorus rising from the valley floor, getting louder and louder. Blue and red lights flashed against my window, strobing through the curtains like a frantic heartbeat. I jumped up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I ran to the window. The driveway, usually so serene, was swarming with vehicles. Not black SUVs this time. Police cars. Guardia di Finanza. They had come. Ferrero hadn't just planted doubt. He had planted a knife in Dominic's back. It was Dominic. He wasn't the composed businessman anymore. He was in shirt sleeves, his tie gone, a gun holstered at his hip. His hair was disheveled, and there was a smear of soot or dirt on his cheek. He looked wild. He looked terrifying. He didn't waste time with explanations. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed my arm. His grip was hard, bruising. He told me we had to move. Now. I pulled back, panic and anger warring in my chest. I asked him if this was it. Was this the moment the decoy served her purpose? Was he going to throw me to the wolves so he could escape? Dominic looked at me, and for a split second, the mask slipped completely. I saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for me. He told me to shut up. He said that if he wanted to leave me, he would have been on a helicopter 10 minutes ago. He said he came back for me. He dragged me into the hallway. It was chaos. Staff were running, shouting orders. Alessandra, his assistant, was shredding documents in the hallway, feeding paper into a machine with frantic efficiency. She didn't even look up as we ran past. We didn't go to the front door. Dominic kicked open a panel in the wall near the library, a servant's passage I hadn't even known existed. It smelled of damp earth and old stone. We scrambled down a narrow spiral staircase, the sound of boots kicking down the front doors echoing above us. We emerged into the garage, but not the main one where the luxury cars were kept. This was a smaller underground bay. There was only one car here, an old, beat-up Land Rover that looked like it belonged on a farm, not in a billionaire's estate. Dominic shoved me into the passenger seat. He didn't open the door for me this time. He vaulted into the driver's seat and keyed the ignition. The engine roared to life with a guttural growl that sounded nothing like the purr of his usual fleet. As the garage door lifted, I saw them. 2 police cars were blocking the lower exit. Men in tactical gear were raising their weapons. Dominic didn't hesitate. He didn't slow down. He slammed his foot on the gas. I screamed, bracing my hands against the dashboard. I thought we were going to die. I thought he was going to ram them. But at the last second, he jerked the wheel to the right, driving the Rover off the pavement and straight through a wooden fence. We went airborne for a terrifying second, landing hard in the vineyard rows. The suspension groaned. Mud splattered the windshield, and we were tearing through the grapevines, branches whipping against the car like angry ghosts. Gunshots popped behind us. I heard the thwack-thwack of bullets hitting the metal frame of the car. Dominic cursed, a low, vicious stream of Italian profanity. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other on my head, pushing me down. He told me to stay down. He told me not to look. We drove like that for what felt like an eternity, careening through fields, smashing through fences, driving in the dark with no headlights to avoid being seen from the air. The helicopter was still above us, its searchlight sweeping the hills, hunting for us. Finally, after 20 minutes of heart-stopping terror, we hit a paved road deep in the woods. Dominic turned on the headlights then, speeding up, putting distance between us and the villa. The silence inside the car was deafening. The only sound was the roar of the engine and my own jagged breathing. I sat up slowly, trembling from head to toe. I looked at Dominic. He was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white, and then I saw it. A dark stain was spreading on the white shoulder of his shirt. He was bleeding. I gasped, reaching out to touch him. I asked him if he was shot. He flinched away from my hand. He said it was nothing. Just grazing. Glass, maybe. He told me to leave it alone. But I couldn't leave it alone. The adrenaline was fading, and in its place, the anger was returning. The fear was returning. I looked at this man, this bleeding, desperate man, and I realized that Ferrero had been right about the raid. He had been right about the danger. So was he right about me? I couldn't hold it in anymore. I asked him. I shouted it over the noise of the engine. I asked him if I was a decoy. Dominic didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the winding road, his jaw set like granite. I demanded an answer. I told him I deserved the truth. After everything, after the lies, the danger, the bullets flying past my head, I deserved to know if our entire relationship was just a strategic move to keep him out of jail. Dominic slammed on the brakes. The Rover skidded to a halt on the side of the deserted mountain road. Dust swirled around us in the headlight beams. He turned to me. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes wild and exhausted. He told me yes. The word hung in the air between us, sharper than the bullet that had grazed him. He admitted it. He didn't try to soften it. He told me that when he first brought me to Italy, that was the plan. He knew the investigation was closing in. He knew they were watching him. He needed a clean face, an innocent American girl with a sick grandmother. It was the perfect cover story. While the police were busy looking at me, wondering who I was, he was moving his assets offshore. He was cleaning his books. He said I was supposed to be a distraction. A shield. I felt like I had been punched in the chest. I couldn't breathe. It was true. All of it. The romance, the clothes, the attention, it was all just camouflage. I opened the door. I couldn't be near him. I needed air. I stumbled out onto the gravel road, the cold night air biting at my skin. I started walking. I didn't know where I was going. Nowhere. Anywhere. Away from him. Dominic was out of the car in a second. He caught up to me, grabbing my arm, spinning me around. I fought him. I hit his chest, sobbing, screaming at him to let me go. I called him a monster. I called him a liar. He took it. He let me hit him. He let me scream until my voice broke. Then, he grabbed my face in his hands, forcing me to look at him. He told me to listen. He said that was the plan before the plane ride, before the dinner, before I stood up for him against Ferrero, before he kissed me. He said he ruined it. He ruined his own plan. He told me that if he had stuck to the plan, he would have left me at the villa tonight. The police would have arrested me. They would have questioned me for days. He would have escaped cleanly, alone, while I took the heat. That was how a decoy worked. But he couldn't do it. He said that when the sirens started, he had a choice. He could leave, or he could save me, and he chose me. He chose to risk his life, his empire, his freedom, just to get me out. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. He told me he fell in love with the decoy, and that was the stupidest thing a man in his position could ever do. I stared at him, my chest heaving. I looked at the blood on his shoulder, blood he had spilled because he came back for me. I looked at the raw honesty in his face. He wasn't lying. A man doesn't destroy his own escape route for a lie. He let go of my face and stepped back. He gestured down the road. He told me that about 2 miles ahead, there was a village. There would be a police station. He told me to take the car, drive there, turn myself in, tell them he kidnapped me, tell them I was a victim. They would believe me. I would be safe. I would go back to America. I would be free. He said he would walk the other way. He would disappear into the woods. He was giving me an out. He was giving me my life back. I looked down the dark road toward the imaginary safety of the village. I thought about New York. I thought about my empty apartment. I thought about the cold, lonely life of invisibility I had lived before him. Safe, boring, empty. Then I looked at Dominic. He was bleeding. He was hunted. He was a criminal. He was dangerous. But he was also the man who had saved my grandmother. He was the man who had looked at me and seen a queen when everyone else saw a waitress. He was the man who had come back for me when the world was burning. I realized then that safety was overrated. Safety was just a slow way to die. I looked at the keys dangling from his hand. I didn't take them. I walked past him, back to the passenger side of the Rover. I opened the door and climbed in. Dominic stood there in the road, stunned. He asked me what I was doing. I looked at him through the open window. I told him to get in the car. I said I didn't know how to drive a stick shift, so unless he wanted to walk to Switzerland, he'd better drive. I told him I wasn't going to the police. I told him that if he was going to hell, I was coming with him, because at least in hell, I wouldn't be alone. Dominic stared at me for a long heartbeat of a second. Then, a slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. Not the wolf's smile, but a man's smile. A smile of relief and disbelief. He walked back to the car. He groaned as he slid into the driver's seat, clutching his shoulder, but his eyes were shining. He reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. His grip was iron tight. He told me I was crazy. I squeezed his hand back. I told him I learned from the best. He put the car in gear, and we drove into the darkness, leaving the lights of the law behind us. We were fugitives now, We were outlaws. But as I watched the sunrise begin to bleed over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of violent violet and gold, I didn't feel afraid. I felt free. The adrenaline that had fueled our escape from Italy eventually burned out, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. I remember the crossing into Switzerland not as a triumph, but as a blur of snow-capped peaks and passport controls that Dominic navigated with a terrifying ease. He had new names for us, new documents waiting in the glove box of the stolen Land Rover. In the span of a few hours, I had ceased to be Elena Russo, the fugitive waitress, and had become someone else entirely. The safe house wasn't a house. It was a fortress disguised as a chalet, nestled high in the Alps, where the air was thin and sharp enough to cut your lungs. It was a place of silence. After the noise of New York, after the chaos of the villa and the screaming sirens of the raid, the silence here was heavy. It was the silence of snow falling on snow, of a world holding its breath. We lived in that silence for the first few weeks. Dominic's shoulder healed, leaving a jagged scar that I traced with my fingers in the dark, a permanent reminder of the choice he had made on that mountain road. He spent his days on encrypted calls, rebuilding the empire that Ferrero had tried to burn down. I spent my days with Rose. The medical transport had arrived just hours after we did. Dominic had kept his promise. Even while we were running for our lives, his network had ensured she was moved safely. She had the best room in the chalet, with a view of the valley that looked like a painting of eternity. But we both knew the truth. We were in the endgame now. The end didn't come with drama. It didn't come with pain. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, while the snow swirled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was sitting by her bed, reading to her from an old Italian poetry book she loved. Dominic was standing by the fireplace, watching us, his presence a silent, solid anchor in the room. Rose stopped breathing for a moment, then took a shallow gasp. She opened her eyes. They weren't cloudy anymore. They were bright, fixed on something I couldn't see. She whispered my grandfather's name, Antonio. She squeezed my hand one last time, her grip surprisingly strong, and told me not to be afraid. She said that love was always a risk, but it was the only risk worth taking. Then, she looked at Dominic. She didn't speak to him, but she nodded. It was a transfer of custody. She was handing me over. She was telling the son of the man her husband died for that I was his responsibility now. And then, she was gone. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I just lay my head on her chest and listened to the silence where her heart used to beat. I felt a hand on my shoulder. Heavy, warm. Dominic didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell me she was in a better place. He just stood there, his hand gripping my shoulder, sharing the weight of the grief so I wouldn't be crushed by it. We buried her in a small cemetery in the village below, under a blanket of white snow. It was just us. No priest, no mourners, just the wolf and the girl he had stolen, saying goodbye to the last link to her old life. In the months that followed, the winter began to thaw, and with it, the ice around my heart began to melt. But it didn't reveal the soft, scared girl I used to be. That girl was buried with Rose. The woman who emerged was different, stronger, colder perhaps, but unbroken. Dominic never spoke much about what happened to Marcus Ferrero. I didn't ask. I didn't need to know the details. I only knew that the calls stopped. The tension in Dominic's shoulders eased. And one day, I saw a small article in a local Italian newspaper online about a tragic boating accident off the coast of Naples. A body was found, ruled a mishap. I closed the laptop and never thought of him again. In our world, justice wasn't a gavel. It was a tide that washed the trash away. 6 months after we arrived in Switzerland, on a night when the moon was full and reflecting off the glaciers, Dominic asked me to join him on the terrace. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and melting snow. Dominic was leaning against the stone railing, looking out at the darkness. He was wearing a black sweater, looking less like a businessman and more like the dangerous exile he had become for me. He turned when I approached. He didn't smile. His face was serious, intense. He told me that the heat had died down. His lawyers had cleared the path. We could go back to Italy, or we could go anywhere else in the world. We were free. My heart stuttered. Was this it? Was he releasing me? Was the transaction finally over? I asked him what he wanted. He reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a velvet box. He didn't pull out a diamond ring that caught the light. He pulled out a heavy gold signet ring. It was old. The metal worn smooth by generations of Vancemen. It bore the family crest, a wolf's head in profile. He took my hand. He didn't kneel. He stood tall, meeting my eyes levelly. He told me that he didn't want a wife to keep in a cage. He didn't want a trophy to display at galas. He had plenty of beautiful things, and they bored him. He said he wanted a partner. He wanted the woman who had the courage to look a shark in the eye and lie without flinching. He wanted the woman who had chosen a fugitive over her own freedom on a dark mountain road. He placed the heavy ring in the palm of my hand. He told me that this ring didn't mean I belonged to him. It meant we belonged to the same pack. It meant that his power was my power. His enemies were my enemies. His blood was my blood. He asked me if I was ready to carry that weight. He warned me that it would be heavy. He warned me that our lives would never be normal. There would be no white picket fences. There would be danger, and silence, and nights where we slept with one eye open. I looked at the ring. It was cold against my skin, but it felt right. It felt like the missing piece of armor I had been searching for my whole life. I thought back to the girl shivering outside the restaurant in New York, terrified of an unpaid bill, terrified of an ex-husband, terrified of her own shadow. That girl was invisible. I looked up at Dominic. I saw the darkness in him, yes, but I also saw the fierce, unwavering loyalty that had saved my grandmother. I saw the man who had burned his escape route for me. I realized then that I didn't want safety. Safety was just waiting for the inevitable. I wanted life. I wanted the fire. I closed my fingers around the ring, making a fist. I felt its edges bite into my palm. I told him I didn't want normal. I told him I wanted everything. Dominic exhaled, a sound like a man dropping a heavy load. He pulled me to him, his kiss sealing the pact. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a vow. A promise of violence and devotion woven together so tightly they could never be separated. As I stood there in his arms, watching the moon rise over the Alps, I knew my transformation was complete. I wasn't Elena the waitress anymore. I wasn't the victim. I was the one who held the leash of the wolf. I looked out at the vast, dark world below us, a world that used to terrify me. Now, it just looked like a chessboard, and for the first time in my life, I was playing as the queen. If you were Elena, would you have chosen the safety of the police station or the danger of the getaway car? Would you trade a normal life for a love that burns the world down? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me share more stories like this with you. Until next time, stay safe or stay dangerous. The choice is yours.